Broadcasting live from the Business RadioX studios in Phoenix, Arizona, it's time for Phoenix Business Radio, spotlighting the city's best businesses and the people who lead them.
Welcome, everyone, to Project Management Office Hours. We are the #1 live project management radio show in the U.S., broadcasting out of the Phoenix Business RadioX studios in Tempe, Arizona. I'm your host, PMO Joe, and I am actually live from my home as we are dealing with the coronavirus situation. And we have our international guest joining us from the UK. We'll be introducing Simon Harris here shortly. I also want to say thank you to our sponsors, the PMO Squad. For over 7 years now, the PMO Squad has been providing project management resources, training, and best practices to help improve and establish your PMO in your organization. Visit www.thepmosquad.com to learn more about all the services they offer. Also, a reminder for everyone to visit projectmanagementofficehours.com to see a list of our upcoming episodes, listen to all of your favorite episodes from the past, and of course, get to know our amazing guests that we've had on over the years. So I'm super excited today to have with us Simon Harris joining. Welcome, Simon. Tell everybody a little bit about yourself.
Thank you. I've been in projects since about 1979, which is why I'm this color. I set my first PMO up in 1999. I've been doing training with folk since before then. In fact, it was a bit of a sideline for a very long time, and the last few years it's been the major activity. I try very hard to take people through how you do the job. I have done the certification training stuff, and at one level it's an easy thing to do because there's a book and that's the thing that people need to study, but it's not where I find life most rewarding. I find the rewarding side of stuff really dealing with what are the hassles and the challenges, of which we are in the midst of some right at the moment, aren't we? And
yeah, certainly.
The question is, where are we going to be in months to come, and how long will it take to get to a new stable? I don't say back to normal because we're never going back. It will be a new forward normal.
Yeah. And where are you located, Simon?
I'm in Edinburgh, in Scotland. Not that you'd tell that from my accent, although you'd get it from my children's accents. My wife found a derelict farmhouse while I was on contract with a local bank. So I was born in London and moved slowly up the country, and we've been in Scotland for more than 20 years now. So we are on the edge of Edinburgh. It's about 3 miles that way.
All right. Very nice. Well, thank you.
I'm doing all right because I have a beer.
Yes, it's 7 o'clock at night or so, I believe, for you, and 11 o'clock for me here in Phoenix. So I wish I'd be having a pint with you, but maybe we can get together one day and do that in person.
I'll be asleep when you're having your beer.
And we had a good friend of yours, Lindsay Scott, on a few episodes back. I pulled the dog story on her that we had discussed offline, you and I think she said for me to ask about your cats, if I remember right.
Yes, we have a cat that particularly likes to sit on my desk here, which Lindsay renamed. The cat's actually called Beryl. We'd had Beryl for a year from the local rescue before we decided, or she told us what her name was, and we called her Beryl the Barrel. She was sort of variously Mrs. Flicky Tail and things. But anyway, Lindsay retitled her Beryl Big Bum, which was she's triangular when she sits down. So yeah, so you did Lindsay on the on Bella.
Yes, yeah.
And Lindsay is doing a weekly sort of thing like this on Wednesdays at 3:00 UK time. I've seen her just whatever it was yesterday.
Well, very nice. Next time I see her, let her know I said hello for me, please.
I will indeed.
All right. Well, so let's get into project management a little bit, or PMOs, and chat through that. If you wanted to, I guess, get us started, just share your thoughts a little bit on PMOs and maybe some unconventional thoughts, I guess, or to what the traditional PMO. I'm in that probably the school of thought similar to you in the sense that the traditional PMO isn't the best approach to go about things, but I think we'll have a fun chat here as to maybe why you and I think that.
Yeah, when you start with something so open as opportunity to talk, it's a challenge to know where to start, really. I think there's a lot of interesting stuff that we could say about the past and why PMOs have been as they are. And I think it's much more interesting to talk about the future because that's the bit that we can influence. It's the place where value sits. And maybe in that journey and into the discussion about the journey into the future, we might need to refer back to the past for some understanding. I'm going to start with a thought that the CFO, Chief Financial Officer, Finance Director in an organization is there because of the way we've constructed capital markets for an organization to use capital. And by capital, I don't mean money, although that is obviously one form. I mean the interconnected shared understanding of a group of people that's in the middle of a supply chain between suppliers and customers. And the finance folks sit there running on a cycle that's dictated by the sun and the moon about monthly accounting. And I'll use the term bean counting, but I don't really mean it in a derogatory sense. So they're there counting how the beans are flowing through the system when that system's in a state of stable cyclic delivery of value. And maybe over the last 30, 20, 50, 75, something like that years, we've seen the rate at which change arrives cause the organization to need to put some specialism around being able to deal with change. And that's given rise to the project management community. And I think that we haven't really written a good understanding of how that process works. So we get confusion with project management and program management and portfolio. And if we want to, we could explore in this conversation what those things are and how they fit together and how they are separate and those sorts of things. But I think that establishes for us a future view of the PMO as the bean counting half of the organization's change function. So the organization has to be a combination of RTO, run the organization, and CTO, change the organization. And the change bit arrives as a result of unnegotiable external pressures and discretionary internal pressures. And somebody has to have an understanding and control of the levers that are in the operational side. And somebody has to have an understanding of what's going on and hands on the levers in the change side. And currently that's two groups. And the second group is potentially the PMO group. And then we have to decide whether or not we want to actually call it something like an SMO for maybe strategy management and then there's a whole bunch of stuff that we can talk about. Is the PMO then usurping the role of the board, the exec, the non-exec, etc., in terms of setting direction and understanding at what point does its authority start and stop in order to be able to support the folk who have duties that are enshrined in law. In the UK, it would be the Companies Act. So there'd be something similar in the US. So that's a sort of attempt to lay out some landscape that answers your very broad question and looking forwards, not backwards.
So if we're kind of taking the PMO then and tying it up, saddling it up next to the finance component of the organization. And as you refer to, we've got the keep the lights on work and the discretionary work.
Yeah.
In today's coronavirus world, we've obviously impacted a lot of that because the discretionary is paused, right? And it's keep the lights on. Let's make sure the company stays around. How do we leverage the skills that we can bring from the project community into a little bit of that keep the lights on world?
Yeah, you're good at these the questions, which are the real challenges. I was in a conversation earlier today with 25 folk where a friend had got somebody from the recruitment industry to come along and share some thoughts about what the job prospects look like in the coming months. And I was in one yesterday, the one that Lindsay and her colleague Eileen had hosted, where they had somebody from one of the sort of mid-sized consultancies in the UK talking about the issues around Corona. You're asking really broad questions. So one thought is that the people who are in organisations sort of the day before lockdown type activities started had a portfolio in flight. And the day after they were relocated, and within like 2 days, they had established the ability to work remotely, even though it was very clunky. And now 4 or 6 weeks further on, some of the infrastructure hygiene type factors have been resolved. So most people now know how to get on a Zoom call, although I'm finding very frequently you have to sort of send a private message to the host that says Alt-M will mute all, because they don't. And so quite often the host doesn't actually know just the basic command structure of things like Zoom. So we've created really quickly the infrastructure ability to converse with each other. Mm-hmm. Some projects, as you've just said, some initiatives, as you just said, have gone on to hold, but not all of them. Some of them, almost the sort of skunk works bit, have managed to stay active because the people dispersed, but the control systems are maybe not quite so robust. So now we've probably got people in organisations who are doing things that are no longer aligned to where the organisation needs to go, because they're aligned to where the organisation was going. So we've got projects that are running that we should be stopping. We've got the potential for a complete change in our supply chain relationships, our customer base, our backwards into who supplies us. And so the strategic landscape that we should have a map of has completely changed and is now out of alignment with the activities that we're running. So we need a portfolio rebalancing activity. Yeah. But an awful lot of organisations are not very good at the portfolio bit. Certainly an awful lot of PMOs feel that they deserve a place at that table, but are not having the conversations, not presenting themselves, or not being accepted to support those dialogues. I think my tuppence worth there would be post this month, we need to be having the conversations with the folk who do legitimately sit at that table, whispering in their ears, saying, if you haven't already worked it out, here are some conversations that need to be happening around that table. I'm not expecting that you give me a seat at it, but I can certainly put some things into your ear that you should, with your colleagues, be discussing around what our portfolio of resource allocations look like. Where are the people who have skill and knowledge about what our landscape looks like, that we can plot our new future? And a huge amount of that plotting the new future in the short term is going to be about how do we generate cash flow so we can cover the payroll? Because unless we cover the payroll, we can't keep the staff. And if we lose the staff, we don't have our knowledge base. We lose that capital. I mean, we might still have the buildings, but they don't do anything on their own. So I think that's sort of where we have to start thinking as a PMO for tomorrow, really, but next week, next month.
One indicator for us, right? Some labor statistics came out here in the States today, and another 3+ million were filed for unemployment. So we're over 33 million unemployed in the last 7 weeks, and I can see that direct reflection in the number of applicants who've applied at the PMO squad is up about tenfold from what's normal, right? So we have a lot of PM specialists and agilists out there who are applying to become consultants because they're they're looking for their next opportunity. So we're in a bit of the not normal world, right? I mean, obviously this has been a disruptor that we haven't really seen before. So we have to account for that and understand that, of course. But you mentioned portfolios in there. So let's go back to, at some point, stability is going to return to the workforce. And let's get out of the COVID world and back to whatever reality will be post-COVID, right? I mean, it's not going to be normal, to your point you said at the beginning.
Well, it will be normal, but it won't be what we see now.
Right. It won't be the old normal, right? It'll be the new normal.
It'll be the new normal. I'm writing this as N with a subscripted N below it. I'm gonna put TM or something on it. So it could have been N squared, and I thought that was too passé. So it's big N subscript.
All right, I like it. So what does that? I can't really say what does that look like. I don't think any of us know. But when we get to the point of having to work through portfolios, and you had said that PMOs might not have been doing that well in the first place, it may be more important that we actually get it right in the next wave here, the next normal. How do you see that? How does portfolio management really going to play into this?
I suspect I have a slightly different mental model from the one you're describing in the question there. I'd see an organization as a collection of capital, of which the most important is the shared knowledge of how to interact between the people who are its workforce, its employees, and its whether they're on the payroll or whether they're paid through sort of consulting arrangements and the accounts payable function, and indeed the links forwards into the customer and backwards into the supply chain. And that's the portfolio, because that's the sum total of all of the resources being deployed that we have access to. And then out of that, we can say some of those resources work on the business as usual and some work on the change stuff. And when we get it right, then we should be saying that portfolio management is about how do I get the best value for money for the taxpayer or the best return on investment for the shareholder. So it's about allocation of resources. And I wasn't trying to say the PMO's bad at this. Mm-hmm. I'm trying to say that organizations per se have been of mixed abilities in their competency with this. So we see organizations wax and wane. Very few organizations now are 50 or 100 years old, for example. So the management structures that we currently use are probably not equal to the dynamics of the environment that the business is running. And they were more suited to it in the past because we had businesses that were much, much older and persisted for much longer. Within the portfolio, we then need to understand how we do the operational stuff. Typically, we're quite good at that. It's cyclic, and humans are very good at stepwise refinement. Mm-hmm. We could go down the path here of single cycle, single loop learning, double loop learning, and triple loop learning. And then on the other side, we have projects and programs, which I don't think we've been well served by the definitions of those. I mean, we had definitions that were as good as we could understand them, and I think our understanding needs to move on. And my characterization would be a project produces a product, and a project manager is a semi-technical person. They have to understand what the project team's doing. Whether you're building an aircraft carrier or a dog kennel, you have to understand the technical work to be the project manager. And I think that maybe some of the stuff that people like PMI publish that starts to try and suggest the project manager's remit should expand in both post-delivery into benefits and pre-sanction into business justification is creating a role definition that's beyond what industry has a need for or an appetite for. So if we define project as the delivery of a product, then we need to say what's program do. And program, I'm going to suggest, takes the whole business change from conception through to benefit flow. And that probably is benefit startup and into stabilization. But the operational leadership should do the benefits optimization and stabilization. So now the definition now is that portfolio management is what the executive team has always been there to do, get the best use of capital. The PMO, because the nature of change that we deal with today requires management structures like, for example, Agile and we shouldn't confine Agile to software development. There was really, really good insight. People like Richard Pascal and his book Surfing the Age of Chaos was showing us what complex adaptive systems thinking, and even von Moltke and Clausewitz, Prussian generals in the sort of end of the 18th, beginning of the 19th century, were showing us how to manage a intent and objective then. So we should be, as PMO, supporting the triangle of the organisation, do the things it needs to do at strategic, tactical, and operational levels. And now is possibly a great opportunity for both organisations and PMOs to re-stocktake about how you combine all that stuff together to be high performing.
So if we have we mislabeled then, or are we allowing labels, PMO, project management office, portfolio management office, program, whatever it may be, the P in your organization, to really not align to what we're doing, right? Because if we're a PMO and you're a project management office, and your guidance is to take executive decisions to manage a portfolio, you're outside your breadth and scope of expertise. And how do we do that, right? So does the PMO in company A, company B, and company C, are they comparable? The definition of a project manager can be comparable and carried across companies because that role is producing in your definition of product.
Yeah.
But that PMO at the organization of A, B, and C are now completely different because of the expectations placed upon them.
I tend to think that that's always been the case and always will be the case. And I tend to think that that's fair. I mean, you mentioned to me earlier that you'd been talking to Lee Lambert.
Yeah.
Helped us all fantastically by being one of the prime movers to create the Project Management Institute. The Bill Duncan putting together the first edition of the PMBOK, which, by the way, you may not see very often, but there's a first edition PMBOK.
It's got a little age on the pages.
Yeah, and I've got the 6th edition here, which is, look at the difference in thickness. I think the first edition actually says more and more useful than the 6th edition. And that's really part of my answer to your question, that I think you're right to reflect that I was saying that the words are not giving us a good description of what the use of these things to look like tomorrow. But they give us a good description of what it looked like yesterday. Mm-hmm. And without the PMI, and in the UK, there was the CCTA, Central Communications and Telecommunications Agency, who wrote a whole bunch of handbooks, which are over there, so I'm not going to go and get those. And that became the Prince and the SSADM manual and stuff like that. Without these people codifying the body of knowledge for it to then be spread, and for that spreading of the knowledge to then allow people to share conversation and move it on, we wouldn't be where we are. But the flip side of it is, and here I am probably going to be a bit more critical of people like the PMI and Axelos, they then encapsulate it into a book that describes yesterday and then ask people to sit down and take an exam in what was the definition of this as of yesterday. I mean, it's the argument about the Spotify model. Have you heard the discussion that people have about Spotify? Nobody uses the Spotify model, including Spotify.
Right.
Because as soon as it was written down, it wasn't what they did anymore.
Right.
There's a quote, I believe, at the beginning of the Spotify description. I can't remember. Is it Kinberg or whatever? It says, don't follow this. This is what works for us. It won't work for you because you're different to us.
Yeah.
So, I agree with the assertion that you made. The words are not right for us. They were right. They have crystallized something that was right, but it isn't what is right, and it isn't what we do need as we move forwards. And that's where our problem is. That's one of our problems.
And we've codified through PMBOK and other manuals, right, other documents like PMBOK, a language that allows project managers to speak that common language. Yet there isn't a comparable document for a PMO leader, right? There's some loosely successful, and they may argue with me over their success or not, organizations in Europe and out of Brazil, of course, and maybe one out of Australia that are trying
Brazil.
to
I don't know about that. What's that? Tell me about that.
Well, you've got the folks with the PMO Value Ring.
Americo Americo.
Yep, his organization out of there. So I mean, there's some work in the space, right? I'm not trying to diminish that at all, but it's certainly not as widely accepted as a PMBOK would be, right? So we don't have that common language of a PMO leader. So it gets to be self-defined from organization to organization. And as we change, right, because nobody stays in the job, the organizations aren't around for 50 years, as you mentioned, but we don't stay in the job for 20 years any longer either. So as I go from organization to organization every 5 years, I carry the definition I had from the prior organization, but they may be using a different definition of the PMO. And oftentimes we see approximately a 3-year life cycle for the PMOs, right, where they fail.
Ooh.
Depending on how you define fail and depending life cycle, again, those are good discussion points.
Yeah, there's a lot of suggestion that is a misquoting of a academic paper by Monique Aubrey, who's is she in Montreal? She's certainly a Canadian university. I'm pretty sure it's Montreal, but not 100%. Yeah, I'm pretty sure that there are those who would say that's a misquote, and the reality is that PMOs transform themselves, and I think that's actually something that might be worth touching on as a topic. I agree with you. There's body of knowledge could be just put around a PMO. A PMO for me fundamentally is a service delivery. I went into an organisation a very, very long time ago. The previous PMO manager had just recently been fired, like the Friday before the Monday I arrived. And it was a big program, 400 people program. And there were people like IBM who were body shopping lots and lots of people in. And so there was a IBM program director who wasn't the top of the tree. And I remember having a conversation with her, sort of, hello, I'm Simon. I've taken the PMO over. And she said, what do you expect me to do with my risk register? And I said, why are you asking? He said, well, your predecessor insisted that I shared it with her and it was completely transparent. And I said, well, I expect you to put real stuff in it and use it and manage it and tell me when it impacts me. But after that, I don't expect you to wash your laundry in public. And she said, well, that's a really different perspective. And I said, well, my view is I'm here as a service provider. I'm not trying to take your job over. You have to tell me what services you need. And then I will, with my team, try and suggest the way in which we can deliver that service. And our primary aim is to be able to create a transparent feed of information across the RAID portfolio, risk assumptions, and I don't know what you want to call the I, issues or interfaces. But if you call the I interfaces, then what's the D for dependencies, etc. So I think that we've got an evolving definition, but that definition's embedded in delivering service to projects. So if I now ask the question, how do you manage services? I'd turn to SIAM, service integration and asset management. I'd look at, I do look at things like COBIT. I've been using COBIT since version 2. I trained a whole bunch of Deloitte risk practice managers in COBIT version 2. And we're up to COBIT 2019 now. That's the integrating platform of how do you make something auditable that does service delivery, and then it sits on top of ITIL version 4 and all the other integratable components. So I sort of wondered, do we need a PMO body of knowledge if we've got a project management body of knowledge and a service management framework that goes backwards into how do we audit? Because by the time you can audit against service levels, you've got governance. So
I would agree. I don't think we need a book, right? Because you had mentioned military intent a bit ago, and I've got
I saw that.
I've got a quote, a general patent quote I love of: never tell people how to do things, tell them what to do, and they'll surprise you with their ingenuity.
Yeah.
And in the military, right, there's commander's intent here in the U.S. military, one of their 6 protocols they work off of, right? We have a common mission. We're going to train the team on how to do their jobs, and we're going to build trust and discipline within the team. But after I tell you the mission, it's up to you to go achieve it.
Yeah.
And I think if we had a PMBOK version for PMO leaders, that would go against that mantra, right? I think we need to bring commander's intent into the corporate world and empower our resources to be able to go deliver for us.
Absolutely. And that's how we've got that challenge with COVID, haven't we? The challenge with COVID is how do we get the folk who have the knowledge, because there are no experts. Nobody knows how to cure COVID. There's no vaccine for it, for example. So we might have a whole bunch of really, really smart hematologists and virologists and all the rest of it, but nobody actually knows how to solve this problem. So the challenge now becomes one of how do you solve a problem that's in a complex adaptive systems space? That is to say, stuff's emergent. You can't pre-plan. You have to be able to react. And it's all these things that the software community picked up when they put some procedure around how do you deliver software. And we got the Agile software movement, which always sort of, there's a dichotomy in there that I wish more people would either argue cogently against me or come to understand, which is Agile is much, much more prescriptive about the process. I mean, if you read the Scrum guide, you will not have more than a 3-hour meeting for a 10-day sprint, for example. It's in fact fantastically prescriptive about the process, but not about the solution space. About the solution space, it's entirely agnostic. One of my favorite pieces of training is to take people through leading complex projects and suggesting to them the ways in which, if you can find out people's motivators and align their motivators with the boss's intention, and then trigger a disaster and get out of the way, because of their the disaster is necessary to cause action. Because asking people to do something mostly gets a response of agreement, but not action. So the triggering a disaster is the trigger for action. But
in corporate world, though, we've been trained that we have a merit increase and a performance review coming up at the end of the year. So my job as an employee is to make my boss happy so that I get a raise.
Absolutely.
Right. I mean, so we're at fault for the world we've built, and I think there's some change agents out there in the world that are trying to drive against that, but it's a big block to push.
Yeah, there are definitely people who have an understanding of how to create different behavioral norms and different cultures that are more successful than others and push against that. So yeah, I think you're quite right. We've learned in the last 50 years, and that's also something that we could explore. That starts to dovetail with where we started, which is why is project management as it is. And partly that comes out of things like engineering. I mean, it comes out, just to not go too far down that pathway, but if we went back 50 or 70 years, very few people were university educated. There are an awful lot of people who could bash rivets. Right. So the folk who were considered to be able to plot strategic vision into the future were a few number of people at the top of the organization, and they could plot the future in an engineering deterministic manner, so they could then command and control folk. You do this. Why? Well, you don't need to know. Just do this, and it will contribute to the end result. So all the people in command and control did what they were told, and we produced the end result. You had a battleship or something, or an office block or whatever. But now all the strategic intelligence is either at the very top or the very bottom of the organization. The folk at the very top of the organization have a vision of the marketplace, but very little of what the technology is capable of. And the folk at the bottom, who are now fantastically educated and have deep understandings of, just how deep can you go into, say, analyzing of mobile phone traffic at Christmas to identify where people are shopping. I mean, that is an actual example of a company that was doing stock price automated trading. They were analysing mobile phone traffic and signal from masts to try and predict how people were shopping at Christmas. We've now got hugely educated components of solutions at the bottom, and the folk at the bottom know what's capable but not what direction to go in. The folk at the top know what direction to go in but not what's capable. Maybe there's a role here. I'm not sure I believe this, but maybe there's a role here for PMOs at this level, and this level to start gluing some of that together. Mm-hmm. Somehow we need ways to glue it together. Another argument is you compress the number of levels in the organization. Another argument is you do the software thing. I mean, I think it was wonderful of the software industry to say, what we need is a product owner. That is to say, the challenge of producing a piece of software is split into two pieces. One is you've got to make the software, and the other is you've got to understand what it does. So we'll just outsource the whole of the problem about what it does to somebody we'll label a product owner.
Yeah.
I mean, take everything that's difficult and put it in the hands of one person and say, you're responsible for everything about linking this to reality.
Well, that's I think, going back to your description and perhaps inconsistent definition in the world about Agile, is because Agile with a lower A, the agility to do things, is confusing to how you do Agile software development. And if we're going to put that knowledge into the hands of a product owner, I can have agility of how to react to an individual's direction. And people lose the methodology, if we want to give it that name, of what Agile's supposed to do when we do that with a product owner, right? So we have this control life cycle versus a development life cycle. And sometimes, since it's misunderstood or not understood, we lose the difference between those, and we just combine them, right? We don't operate under one or the other. They just mix into one way to operate.
I agree. I was having a Twitter conversation today with somebody who really made me smile, because he said, from Ada Lovelace to today is, I can't remember the numbers, like 175 years. And from Snowbird to today is whatever it is, 21 years or 19 or something. And that's 13%. So we've had agile thinking for 13% of the amount of time that we've been doing software development. To which my response was to say, why did you start with Ada Lovelace? Why didn't you go back to Jacquard looms? But that may be a bit too subtle a joke for perhaps some of the PMO audience, because it's a fairly software oriented discussion. But it was a very validly made point that we're still really working out how to do a lot of this stuff, and the world around us is changing as we're moving, and the stuff that we're working out better solutions for how to do it than we had 10 years ago and the like. And if we could get things like this to not solidify it in ways that then mean that it becomes Aussified and doesn't, things like that have a purpose. And I think we've really sort of got to the point of some of this is a bit imponderable. So we can. There are some things that you can see with clarity, mm-hmm. but beyond that, the paradigm shift that we need is not predictable. Maybe it's the Einstein quote, which is, you can't, whether he said it or not, which is you can't solve a problem with the thinking that created it. That's always our challenge.
Isn't that evolution, right? I mean, the Agile for the past 13% of all of software development is because we've evolved into Agile, and what will we evolve into next?
Yeah. It does seem at the moment there's an awful lot of people who are evolving Agile into go back 20 years. So Agile agnostic and the real Agile and the heart of Agile. These are all phrases I hear that I'm far too ignorant to talk about them really, but they sound to me like they're let's go back to our roots. We've gone off in a direction that maybe is not as insightful as the insights that 20 years ago spurred the direction. And maybe part of that is things like SAFe. I hear a lot of people voicing opinions about SAFe. Mostly negative, I'd say. Mostly this is taking us back into Big Four consulting and corporate territory, and has denatured the ideals that were there. And I've no visibility of what PMI will do with DAD and Flex and things like that. But we have to wonder there, is the PMI a project management institute or a software development institute now? It'd be really great to have somebody who would clarify and defend or otherwise debate that. I'm sure it's a very inflammatory and reactionary statement on my part to say it, but I'd like to hear an argument against it.
Well, I think it's a good observation. I mean, and you're not alone in that observation, right? I mean, if the Project Management Institute purchases Disciplined Agile, you've just expanded the boundaries that were originally built, and that's not right or wrong. It's just an observation, right? I mean,
but you've taken the whole organization in the direction of one industry.
Yeah. And I don't know if that's evolution, and that's okay. But what's the strategy behind that, and where? I
think if I was a mechanical engineer in oil and gas, I'd be wondering about whether or not I still have somebody who represents me, and maybe I ought to go off and join the American Association of Cost Engineers or somebody like that.
Well, certainly, yeah. If I'm going to be building a bridge, I don't want to prototype it, and have some cars fall off. I mean, traditional project management isn't going away, right?
Absolutely, yeah. The front end loading and front end engineering design steps within a mature engineering life cycle, where you build what you know will work because you did the activities that you needed to do for that, which would include, by the way, prototyping, but in a different way to software.
Right.
Those things are still necessary. There's a lot of people involved in oil and gas and pharma and civil engineering, electrical, marine, and aeronautical, etc., that maybe have some crossover needs to have conversation with software engineering. I mean, there's synergies. There's value in travel, broadens the mind. Talk to colleagues in other disciplines. But the PMI, I don't really want to get into the sort of territory of questioning their integrity. But the PMI was, I thought, Project Management Institute, and that wasn't industry specific. Because there have been some industry specific versions of the PMBOK, and I think that's entirely appropriate. Here's the PMBOK, and here's the version of the PMBOK guide. Just to be sorry, Bill.
Yeah.
Sorry, Duncan.
Don't get on his wrath.
Yeah. And he and Stacey did tell me once a long time ago. Oh, I see you call it the guide. Well done. Like, but there was a defense extensions version. There was a software extensions version, and that's all entirely appropriate. I don't know.
Well, we've diverted a bit away from PMO, so let me bring us back there and delve into a question about reinventing PMOs periodically. Right? To help me understand,
okay.
I think you've got some thought process behind that, and that the PMO isn't a stagnant function. It's a reinventing one. Where are you going with that?
Yeah, I'm not going to claim original thought here, or I'm not going to claim original stimulus. So, but if we go back to that example I was using earlier, so I joined that organisation, and there was a standing PMO that I went in and and started working in I was running it. So I did start working in it, but I was responsible for its direction. And there were a number of things that it was doing that I didn't think were appropriate. And there were a couple of things that it wasn't doing that as I went around. So I went around the senior leadership team who were the folk who sat at the same table as me on a weekly basis when I was expected to sort of say stuff about where we were to the guy who was direct report into the global finance director. And I'd gone and asked them, what do you need me to do for you? Which had shocked them all because they were used to being told, this is what you're going to do. So being asked the question was, and I found there was stuff that we weren't doing that they wanted, and there was stuff that we were doing that was a pain in the arse to them, duplicated stuff for them, didn't offer them value. I couldn't find where it offered other people value, so I stopped it. It just seems to me that that's axiomatic. I had a rule of thumb, and the rule of thumb's a bit apocryphal rather than literal, but I had people coming to me occasionally and saying, we need to put this in the project standards. And I'd say, well, okay, that's fine, but you've got to find something to take out if you're going to put that in, because I'm not allowing you to create a standards document that's more than 35 pages long. And they said to me, why 35 pages? And I said, it's a number I picked out the air, and if you want to have a different number, then if you justify it to me and you persuade me, we'll have a different number. But 35 is the number I've picked, and it contains the things that when we don't do them, we get in trouble. And we have been learning as a result of having those things in that standard to habitually not do things wrong. So there are things it says that people no longer read because they don't need the guidance, because it's become embedded in the team interactions. Mm-hmm. And that's what I mean by the PMO needs to reinvent itself. And that's what I've heard other people say, and I completely agree with it. If your PMO is doing the same thing 18 months after it started doing something, then you have to ask yourself, did we establish when we put this service in place the reasoning with the community that we're imposing upon why they need to do it for the benefit of some other community? I mean, it's typically the senior leadership need to understand that you have to give clarity on the way down and that you have to respond when there are escalations coming back up. And I start there because most people would have expected me to start at the bottom and say, the folk at the bottom have to understand that you create a progress report like this because we have to aggregate the data. So it runs in both directions. So if I'm still having to have the same conversation with people 18 months after the need arose, then that suggests to me that I didn't do the explaining and the educating bit well enough. And if we establish that somewhere in the hierarchy there's some dysfunction and we want to put some rules around it, some guidance around it, and some procedure, then I would hope in less than 18 months, people have come to a position where they sort of sufficiently understand it that I don't need to still be focusing on it. In which case now I've got bandwidth and capacity to do other stuff. So as a PMO, let's stop doing that. I'm not saying the organisation should stop doing it. I'm just saying I don't have to support it or police it. So I should be doing something else. And that's an opportunity then to actually move my focus up the organisation's value chain, which isn't always what people want and isn't necessarily. I mean, I keep hearing people say the PMO should operate at the top level of the organisation. And I can't quite bring myself to say, no, it shouldn't. But I do always have to ask, well, if you do that, when you get up to the senior leadership level, haven't you just duplicated the responsibilities that these people already had? Isn't that why they're there? They're not there to supervise, they're there to direct and lead. And that means anticipating and strategizing and allocating resources, etc. But at least in the reinventing bit, I'm asking the question, what can I do now that uses the resources with the most incremental value in the future? And that's where I think the reinvent bit comes. That's the place of reinvention. It's every month, every 6 weeks, every quarter, asking the question.
I'm with you on this one. I think we're on lockstep, and at the PMO squad, right, where we created our version of the value ring, we call it the purpose-driven PMO.
Yeah.
Because if you haven't defined your purpose, you don't know what you're doing, And your purpose continually changes as you get changes to the executive team or natural disaster strikes like we're in now. And if you don't reinvent and you're not aligned organizationally with what that reinvention is, how can you have success? I mean, the people who will be defining success for you are either going to be in agreement with what you're doing or in conflict with what you're doing. So I agree with you, and I think it's I think that's the evolution of the PMO, because I think the old PMO was, we're going to be governance, we're going to be an auditing function, and we're going to make sure you do the process.
Yes.
We're not going to ensure the value, because the organization's ownership of strategy and value is going to determine that. I think the reinvention is what we do, right? We're not the accounting department where you handle accounts receivable and accounts payable over and over again, right? Every piece of work we have is new.
Yeah.
So if we're not reinventing ourselves to align with the new direction of the company, how can we be successful?
Yeah, I agree with that entirely. A phrase I like here speaks to me is consistency of outcome, not consistency of process.
Yes.
And I think if I'm the FD, I'm going to say consistency of process, because that delivers consistency of outcome. But if I'm the PMO, I'm going to say constantly changing combination of factors with a goal of consistent outcomes means different process in every case, in which case what I'm now talking about is having a set of principles or values that I can interpret situationally. And now we could go into models of complexity and those sorts of conversations.
Well, and it brings us back to the description of how militaries function, right? Its missions and commanders' intent are unique.
Yeah.
Yet in between missions, they train on discipline so that you get repeatable behavior and trust within your team.
Yeah.
In addition to that, right, in the military, they bring the project to the team.
Yes.
Whereas in corporate America, we bring the team to the project.
Yeah.
And we bring in these disparate resources who may have never worked before. So there's no trust within the teams. And
okay.
Again, we can go down a long rabbit hole with that discussion. But to your point of, the military does a lot of things right that we in corporate America or corporate world, regardless of America or not, just we haven't learned from.
There was a book by two Japanese professors, Nanaka and Taguchi, I think are the right names, who likened Japanese industry to a rugby match and Western industry to a relay race, and said some of the things that you've just said, like the right way is to keep the team together and bring the work to them, because the team is the thing that's of a value.
Yeah.
I don't know it for a fact, but I believe that it was a misunderstanding in the folk who were originally discussing Agile, but knowledge of that book that led them to come up with the phrase about Scrum, which you don't make progress in a scrum in a rugby match. If you do, you get foul. The referee blows a whistle. This you hold the scrum. There's a whole bunch of things there that would say, "Why did you call it scrum? Why didn't you call it running line or something?"
Right.
Yeah.
Well, we have exhausted our time. It's again, what a great conversation and fun, and how quickly it goes. So, Simon, thank you so much for being on the show today and sharing your thoughts with everybody, as we need some good conversation in these days to take our minds off of what's out there, right, and give us some pause to be able to think about some things. So thank you so much for that.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity. And we've explored the landscape, and I was deliberately trying to find ways in which to perhaps describe some of it in what you might either call provocative or thought-provoking terms. I think generally we actually do a pretty amazing job with not a lot of appreciation, because we're often in a position where we are imposing things on people, and that's necessary. But I think we do need to think about where our future ability to generate the most value lies, and if we do that gives us all much longer careers. Not that I'm looking for much longer.
Is there I'll give you another moment here to be able to let the listeners know how to get in touch with you, or if you have any anything coming up that might be of interest for them, how they can hear more that you have to offer?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. I'm very easily detectable on LinkedIn, just Simon Harris PMP, all one word. And like the rest of the world, actually for about the last 5 years, I've been moving a lot of my training into online stuff. So I have a website on learn.logicalmodel.net that has various things on it. There's quite a lot on it for free. There's stuff on it that's paid for. I'm doing a bunch of virtual instructor-led stuff over the next sort of 6 weeks or so scheduled, which is being arranged through IPMO Advisory MENA. If you find me on LinkedIn, then you'll find the route through to them. If I was smarter and more sales oriented, I'd have had the web page up here and I'd have shared the screen with the web address on it. But if you just look for IPO Advisory MENA, Middle East, North Africa, or if you search for me on LinkedIn and chain through that way, then that will find your stuff. But no, I'm not 100% commercially. This wasn't about how can we drag people on training courses.
Yeah.
But hey, if you want to come and join a training course with me and have this sort of discussion and kick the arguments around, then that's definitely something I'm up for.
Well, fantastic. Thank you again, Simon. And obviously thank you to all of our listeners. Be sure to visit projectmanagementofficehours.com to check out all the great content, shows, and upcoming guests. We've got a great lineup coming up. Stuart Easton will be joining us next out of the
Say hello to Stuart for me.
Absolutely. And then we'll have Lee Lambert, Jesse Fuel. We got Cornelius Fichtner coming up, and of course, so many more. A reminder, of course, these shows are live, but we also record them. So be sure to subscribe to Project Management Office Hours podcast on Apple Podcast, iHeartRadio, Spotify, Spreaker, whatever your podcast platform of choice is. And of course, thank you to our sponsor, the PMO Squad. Without the PMO Squad, none of this would be possible. Visit www.thepmosquad.com to learn more about the purpose-driven PMO and all of their services. So that's it for now. Office hours are closed. Until next time, I'm PMO Joe, and you've been listening to Project Management Office Hours.